Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about flingers in Arknights and kind of game design bloat. We'll get into it. Arknights, flingers versus artillerymen, or my husbando is part of an unpopular and somewhat redundant class. Gray, the lightning bearer, pictured on screen, we'll bring him back in a minute, but just so you have a visual reference, is a really weird unit. The Flinger class hitting twice per attack, full damage plus another hit of 50% damage, interacts, unfortunately, with high enemy armor. We'll get back to it. Flinger snipers being unable to hit aerial enemies is even more unfortunate. These flaws have made people less likely to try to get Gray over the more straightforward alternative of artillerymen snipers. Artillerymen generally have higher attack stats than Flingers, which is better against tougher enemies. It's no wonder the 1/6-star Flinger operator has a passive that ignores 160 armor. That's like 320% attack. 3 plus 320 attack. But, and this is going to be my main point in attempting to redeem Gray, artillerymen have a slower attack speed. Attacking faster seems like the better deal if your goal is dealing with crowds of enemies, and I should hope enemies in crowds have less armor on average. That's the gist of the parlay, but there's some more talking points comparing Gray to Shirayuki. They both get weirdly big range, both can slow enemies, and both get access to arts damage with their skill too. Sure. Let's leave Gray on the screen for a little. I put him on the other side and not the usual side because it's better contrast because he is brown. His name is Gray. He is very brown. I like this character's design personally. I think the electro grenade dispenser thing on his back is cool and it's fun. His sprite is animated in missions, so you can see the little grenades getting dispensed out of it so he can throw them at enemies. That's quite satisfying. It just, anyway, for what it's worth, like, yeah, this guy's cool. It's too bad he's bad. Why is he bad? This parlay is going to be 3 sections. We're going to talk about Gray. We're just going to talk about Gray. You said my husbando is part of an unpopular and somewhat redundant class. We can at least discuss a little bit. It is kind of interesting why he's bad. You got into it a little bit. I think there are other reasons why he's bad. And he's also not like that bad. One of the great things about Arknights is that the balance is very close and I think often hits that threshold of being kind of good enough, where you don't lose enough by using something suboptimal that it really is suboptimal unless you are in a very demanding situation and or extremely aggressively know what you're doing in a way you probably wouldn't go after understanding because you don't need to know that to play the game. And so I think for the most part, it's not like you can't use them. And so we will talk about that. I also want to talk about why flingers even exist. So why is this archetype in the game if it's bad in ways that are kind of fundamental aspects of the game? Why did they make that if it's bad in a way that doesn't really have to do with specific flingers? Doing damage in Arknights in this way is essentially always bad. So why did they put that in the game? That's just weird, right? But I think there are some pretty obvious reasons and some less obvious ones. And I also don't think it's as bad as it appears. And then how about a niche for flingers? I mean, they're good at some stuff, right? Yeah, maybe if those mechanics showed up more, but there are mechanics in the game that flingers counter very well, or not too badly anyway. And so, yeah, I don't know about very well. Well, anyway, let's get going. So first of all, Gray. Let's bring him back. We'll leave Gray up for this section. So what's the deal with the Flinger thing? Let's go through the points that vampbug made one by one, and then I'm going to add some stuff. So the first thing is that flingers hit twice per attack. They throw a grenade, sort of. They fling something. Flinger is such a ridiculous name. Anyway, and when it hits, it's an AoE, hits everything in the AoE. That's actually pretty uncommon in Arknights. Not very many attacks hit everything in their AoE. Usually if they hit an area or they attack an area, it's specific numbers of targets at once. Things that are actually an area of effect that just hit everything in that radius are not that common. So that's good. And very few of them have long range. Flingers have rather long range, one of the longest ranges of any archetype. So they throw an AoE, and then you also get another AoE that does 50% of the damage. They both hit everyone in the radius. Now, you said interacts unfortunately with high enemy armor. So the idea here is that in Arknights, armor, they've done an interesting thing where armor is just a number that subtracts damage that you take. So if you take physical damage and you have 300 armor, all physical damage you take is reduced by the number 300. It's not a percent damage reduction that's converted using some formula. You literally just take that much less damage. It's kind of like impact absorption, I guess. Whereas resistance, which is like the defensive stat against arts damage, is like a percent defense thing. So if you have 10 or 15 resistance, you're getting some amount of arts damage reduction. You know, like imagine it's like 10 or 15%, but it may be different. I actually don't know exactly what the formula is. The point is it's a percent reduction to all arts damage. Because armor defense in Arknights is a number that reduces physical damage you take by a flat amount. Higher hit physical attacks are generally more powerful in that they, percent-wise get penalized less by enemy armor. If you attacked 1 time every 10 seconds for 1,000 damage versus 10 times, once every second for 10 seconds, for 100 damage, it's much better to have attacked that 1 time every 10 seconds from a damage perspective, because you only get your damage mitigated by armor once instead of 10 times. Of course, it's in that example that you can see that obviously it only goes to a point. If you attack so slowly that enemies might leave your range without you attacking, well, that's not good. But very few archetypes are like that. In Arknights, almost all units' attack speed ranges between 1 and 3 seconds per attack. Gray is a Flinger, and the Flingers have a 2.1 attack speed. So not too bad, though that is a little slow. So that's why it's bad with armor. They attack fairly slowly and concentrate their damage into relatively fewer higher damage attacks. But the problem is their trait kind of undoes that strength a little bit. They're balanced to have slightly lower attack than similar units, which we'll talk about in a minute, but you mentioned earlier, because they have 2 hits of damage. But the problem is, in Arknights, that means they get mitigated by armor twice. It's not like they just do 50% more damage. They get another hit that does only 50% of damage, meaning it gets even more heavily mitigated by armor. Not good. As a way to kind of trade some raw attack stat, but get the damage back in this other way, it's a bad trade in Arknights. That's true. Okay, Flingers can't hit aerial enemies. Yeah, one of the elegant things they've done in Arknights is there are many layers of niche in the game. You have a sniper. Snipers are their range tile units. They can nearly always hit aerial enemies. In fact, I think this is the only sniper archetype that can't hit aerial enemies. And, they often have some kind of targeting priority. They do physical damage, primarily. So if you have a sniper, you can pretty much know that it's going to be those things. Then you have a specific archetype of sniper, like an artilleryman. An artillerist might have, this set range, and so they're going to attack in that range. They have a little dead zone. If enemies are close to them, they can't attack them, but they have a wide, larger range in front of them. And they generally have high attack stats, low attack speed. Those things are kind of standard for the archetype, so you know what you're getting into at that layer. And then, of course, the unit will have their own particular abilities and traits and stuff. So there are kind of 3 layers of general to a little bit less general to specific expectations you can set. And I think another bad thing about the Flinger archetype is that they buck those expectations, but for no real reason. So for example, having a sniper that is really strong, but they can't hit aerial enemies, sounds like maybe kind of fun, I guess, but instead they're the weakest sniper archetype, and they can't do like the reliable thing that you would want out of a sniper. That's just not good. It's not necessarily a huge problem. You can find places in the game where it just doesn't matter if they're hitting aerial enemies. We'll get into that in a few minutes. It doesn't really matter, not really. But since the purpose of this is to discuss the surprisingly complicated ways in which Flingers are bad, I do think that's one of them. It's that they kind of break a sort of basic expectation of a sniper, which is that they can hit aerial enemies. They kind of cover that. They fill that job. They're generally pretty good at that. And Flingers are the only, I think, sniper archetype that does not do that. That's really bad, and it's an unjustified trade-off. You don't get anything in exchange for that more narrow scope of coverage. I personally think having classes in Arknights or like whatever game, having those general archetypes be very ironclad rule guided, guided by some principle that they do not break. So the player can rely on, if I have a sniper, they can hit aerial enemies. I think that's a good rule. It's not so bad to have there be some expectations the player can meet. And in the first place, why can't flingers hit aerial enemies? Rosmontis, she's the 6-star flinger we have currently. She uses these big pillars that slam into the ground. I guess it doesn't look like those could hit aerial enemies. I feel like that doesn't really matter, but anyway, whatever. I guess I sort of understand that. But Gray is he's just throwing electromagnetic grenades, dude. Why can't it just hit aerial enemies? He lobs it. You cook a grenade, you pull out the pin, you lob it in the air at the right time, and then it explodes in midair. He's like a scientist in the lore. This man, his token that you get when you get an extra copy of him and he gets a little stronger, it's literally a dissertation that he wrote. Like he can cook a grenade. Like, let him hit aerial enemies. Anyway, whatever. That's incredibly stupid. Okay, another point that came up is the idea that artillerymen snipers are an interesting point of corollary. I want to compare the two for a minute. Because you go on to compare how artillerymen have slower attack speed. I actually think that's a less exciting benefit. Artillerymen usually have very high attack stats, but then they have a very slow attack speed in the grand scheme of things. But it's not really much slower than flingers. Flingers are 2.1 seconds, and artillerymen are 2.4. So while they are slower, the percent difference in terms of the damage per second output they're doing is not that significant. It's not nothing, but it's not huge. And the massive increase in attack really makes up for it. As an example, because I have had bad experiences with this archetype, but I don't, own Gray, for example. I took a random artilleryman. I'm having trouble with artilleryman. I'm saying artillerist. That I happened to have built. Totter. He's a lower rarity artillerist. He has 200-ish more attack than Gray at Elite 2 level 1. Gray has like in the 500s and Totter has in the 700s. And Gray does do an extra instance of damage, that is 50% of the damage, but we've talked about how that's heavily mitigated by armor. That sounds good, but it's actually really bad in practice most of the time. And if the enemy has more armor, it only gets worse. Totter is also, extremely cheap to develop and free in the sense that he's a 4-star and therefore you just kind of get him. Gray you may not even have, whereas even if you did or you sought him out, you would get a much weaker package in exchange or for your efforts. That just seems sad. And their ranges are different. This is where I think they're maybe a little more interesting, and we're going to begin to segue into why they even exist in a few minutes. Artillerymen have that wide, they can't attack right next to them, but then outside that basic, like melee kind of looking range, they can attack a big wide area in front of them. In a tower defense game, I think that range is great. A lot of the time, enemies and the sort of tiles available to you to place units are spread out in such a way that you have a ranged tile right near the objective, and you can put some defenders to block off routes to that objective that will make it so the minimum range problem for artillerists, where they can't attack enemies right next to them, just doesn't really happen. Enemies just won't get there if you put them near, the objective. And having them have much longer range also means they can plink off enemies in the distance too, so you can kind of spawn camp enemies a little bit. I found artillerists to be really good at that. They have such a wide range, you can often cover multiple enemy spawn points and start shooting them the moment they come out. That can be really effective. On the other hand, Flingers also have long range, but it's a straightforward long range. They just have a big range in front of them, just like a normal 3 or 4 tiles in front of them in every direction except behind them, sort of, that in which they can attack. It's the same range as Deadeye snipers, another long-range sniper archetype that has high damage per hit and slow attack speed, just like artillerists, which is randomly better than Flingers. So Flingers are essentially just Deadeye snipers, but they're faster, they do an AoE, and they do their damage in 2 separate hits, which are all bad things. Well, the AoE thing is good, I guess, but at the same time, artillerists and Deadeye snipers are very slow, and Flingers attack faster. I like the idea that you said that, you know, if you're dealing with crowds of enemies, you should hope that the crowd of enemies, lots of enemies, are weaker on average, and therefore hitting twice and getting the demerit of armor, reducing your damage twice, is probably the least of a problem when an AoE unit would be good. Yes, that makes sense. It's also worth noting that, and we'll get into it more later, that Gray does have a skill that makes him do arts damage in an AoE. So he can bypass the whole defense thing to some extent, and there are very few snipers that can do that. Most casters that do arts damage and therefore bypass defense, they deal with resistance instead. Most casters have very short range. So having a long range unit that does substantial arts damage in an AoE is actually quite rare. So that's one thing. But I don't know. I mean, as you said, I think Shiryuki is a close competitor. There are, as much as I just said that was a rare thing, actually quite a few units in Arknights that randomly have like a range extension ability. It's kind of common for a unit to have an ability where, you know, normally they can attack 3 tiles ahead of them. And when they use their ability, they temporarily get like a 1 or 2 tile extension. These are pretty cool in my opinion because they extend whatever the operator's range is forward. So if they have, 3 tiles in front of them, that's their range. Then they extend 1 tile forward, all 3 of those like lanes or whatever. If they have a really wide range, like 5 tiles or something, if they got a range extension, it would extend all of that forward. I can't think of any units that have Gray's range, like a really wide range, and who extend that all forward, but it would cover a truly massive part of the battlefield if it existed. Indeed, most of the range extension units have a narrower range, and they can make it long, rather than having a more balanced range like Gray does. Shiryuki is one example. She's kind of another AoE sniper archetype. Oh, whoops, there's another AoE sniper archetype. Whoops, yikes. Yes, I don't remember what these are called. Grenadiers? Bombarders? Anyway, that have modest range, and they fire in front of them and do big damage. It's occurring to me as I'm talking about this, they do big damage, that you may have been referring to this archetype this whole time, and so I really should look one of those up. Is Totter a besieger and not an artillerist? These names are ridiculous. Let's just look it up right now. Gray, get out of here for a sec. I'm messing up the parlay. They are called besiegers. I was thinking of besiegers. Let's look at artillerists. Okay, let's look at Shiryuki. So she's a 4-star, so a rarity lower than Gray. Artillerists, that is what they're called, artillerymen. Their range is just 3 lanes in front of them, so narrower than Gray's, but pretty long, equally long, just narrower in front of them. And yeah, Shiryuki is a 4-star freebie with a similar skill. Gray has this thing where he'll throw a ball lightning grenade, and it does arts damage in an area for a while. I really like this kind of skill, just as an aside. It's kind of like a secondary fire. You have like a grenade launcher mounted under your weapon, and when there's a bunch of enemies, you can hit that button to fire an extra attack while he's doing his normal attacks. I just find that type of skill very fun to operate. I think it holds a few charges, too. It's a skill like that. I really like that skill. Gray's skill 2 is fun to use, in my opinion. But not that good. The damage is just very modest. Shiryuki has a kind of similar ability. So she throws these big shuriken. And she's got a skill where, for a period of time, she throws big shuriken that will spin in place when they hit the enemy. She'll target individual enemies, but then when the shuriken reaches the enemy, it will spin in place and do AoE damage. That skill is similar to Gray in a few ways. It converts her damage to arts damage. She otherwise has sort of similar AoE range. And it does damage that lingers. Shiryuki's skill 2 slows enemies in the area, and Gray has a passive that just gives all his attacks a chance to slow. He does hit twice with his normal attacks, so the consistency of that is like maybe okay, but it's still not great. But there are various problems. Like one of them is that the artilleryman archetype has a module, if you upgrade them a lot, that makes them ignore a little bit of enemy defense. And you even mentioned that the other, one of the only other Flingers, the 6-star Flinger, has a passive that makes her ignore some defense. So that's interesting. I mean, it's like in the same breath that they've made the archetype, they kind of know that that's going to be the problem. And so they made all these things ignore some defense. But then why even have the archetypes work this way? Shiryuki makes perfect sense. She throws one big shuriken that does one big hit of damage. I had meant to check to what speed that is. I assumed the whole time you were talking about besiegers, but you know, that's a good detail for this parlay, because I think part of the problem with Flingers is that there are several archetypes that overlap them. Besiegers, artillerymen, and Deadeye snipers. All three of these archetypes attack in a similar range, generally have higher attack stats. I checked Shiryuki and it's also higher. They attack slower, but not that much slower, especially Besiegers, the archetype I was thinking you were talking about. And the only real thing about Flingers is they are doing an AoE. Now, the archetype you actually meant, Artillerymen, they do attack slow, 2.8 seconds, and then Flingers are 2.1. So it's substantially faster, kind of AoE coverage. And indeed, I would say that this, now that I understand the archetype we're talking about properly, because there's like 4 archetypes that are similar to this, man, I didn't intend this, but this is a good setup for the topic I want to talk about after this. This archetype doesn't have a lot of strong members. I think that's a kind of another detail here. Some of the sniper archetypes are really bloated. Marksman snipers that just have a normal 3x4 range, your standard sniper. They're a range unit on a range tile that does physical damage. They shoot enemies. There's like a million of those. There's so many of them, way too many in my opinion. And quite a few of them have abilities that make them kind of mimic other sniper archetypes. I do not know why they did this, but then there are like 4 or 5 other really weird sniper archetypes that have like 2 units and they're just not very good. And the weird thing about this sort of Flinger and similar archetype territory is it's kind of like that. A lot of the archetypes are kind of buoyed by the fact that there aren't very many of them that exist. There just aren't very many Flingers. There aren't very many, Besiegers or whatever. But generally there will be 1 or 2 souped up ones that are pretty good. And I think the trouble is that the bones of those other archetypes are kind of good. Just being that archetype is good because the basic stats and parameters they're built of are basically good, like pretty much good things. Whereas being a Flinger is inherently bad, which is sort of interesting in theory. But again, I feel like it sort of breaks a promise the game is making to the player without enough of a gain. I don't want to spend too much of this parlay too down on a character that you commission this parlay because you like. So I hope we can highlight that it's still fun. I think that the random slows, while they are random, because he hits twice, if both hits can trigger the slow, which I'm not sure they can, but they probably can, it should be a fairly consistent slow. And I would imagine that Gray would be good in a situation where there's another similar range character that wants to bombard enemies while they're in Gray's range, and then he's slowing enemies periodically, where you're not relying on the slow, but he always has a chance to slow at all times. It's not a skill, he just has that as a passive. So if he's keeping enemies in his range on average for longer, and you have some other operator with a peculiar range that wants to keep enemies in that spot for longer, ideally, and then when that doesn't happen, you still have defenders set up so that you can catch the enemies that would have leaked, I feel like that sounds pretty good. Like some simple archetypes that come to mind are, oh, literally every single sniper archetype I talked about, fair enough, but he could be good with them. That's not a bad thing. And also fortress defenders. These are defenders that have very long-range cannons, but they have a big dead zone. And one of the problems with fortress defenders is their actual bombard radius, where they can actually hit enemies, is not very big. You need to keep enemies in a rather small area for fortress defenders to be able to wail on them. So slows are really good for doing that. You know, when I was reading some criticism about Gray in a quick little prep session for this parlay, one of the things I noticed people mentioning is that he applies slow as his utility, which is, it's not very uncommon. A lot of things slow in Arknights. But they kind of don't in this way, is sort of my 2 cents. If there's something that I feel like he's kind of good at, a slow in an AoE at long range from a sniper, there are some other snipers that do slows, but often at shorter range. I don't know that is actually that common, applying the slow that way. And then the problem is that it's not reliable, but his ball lightning grenade does reliably slow in its area. I don't know if there's really a lose there. I feel like for the slow niche, that's maybe kind of good. So as supporting fire, while other units are going to take advantage of enemies being stuck in their range for longer. He seems kind of good for that niche. If you use him for that, I don't think you're losing much. And, you know, it's not like he's so bad. We were comparing, oh, he has 2.1 attack speed, whereas besiegers, which I mistook for artillerymen, have a 2.4 attack speed. That's so bad. You know, it's not that bad. It's fine. It is still kind of weird, though. So why the heck do flingers exist? Why did they make this? Why is the archetype so redundant with other archetypes? Relatively redundant, anyway. They're kind of like the opposite of Deadeyes. They have the same range as a Deadeye, but they hit multiple times and in an AoE instead of a single time, slower, but with really high single target damage. Sort of, I guess, but it's bad to do damage that way. You know, they're very similar to other archetypes. They do damage in a way that is kind of inherently against the game's math. And in the first place, there are very few of them, and there are other sniper archetypes that have very few units. Where was the need to make a new archetype? Now, I don't entirely understand. I do feel like this is a place where you can see a gacha economy, where you roll for characters at random and there are a gajillion characters. You can kind of see that making the game not worse, but not better here. I think that having a unit in a new archetype is one of the main knobs that these games use to get people to roll more. You want to have a unit of every archetype, people think. Now, you don't, really. I think that one of the good pieces of design in Arknights that I was talking up before is the idea that because the archetypes have general promises of value, snipers can hit aerial units usually. You know, casters will do arts damage, etc. Healers will heal, I suppose. You get the idea. Because those general promises are there, you don't really need very specific archetypes to do the thing. And in the very few cases where you sort of do, we have been given those as kind of basic units. So an example would be, sometimes the game is really punishing you if you can't do AoE damage, a true AoE that hits everything in the radius. But of course, the game gives you an AoE caster so that you have a member of that archetype guaranteed, and an artilleryman sniper as well. They're not amazing, but when that niche is useful, they're so good that it doesn't matter that it's like a lower rarity one. They still end up being good. And so the game has kind of solved that problem. It's not actually a problem. In and of itself, it's interesting how games that set up character-based economies like this do this thing where the good ones will walk a fine line where you have reasons you want new characters, but you objectively don't really benefit much from getting the new characters. That's really interesting in a way, but is also kind of sinister. And anyway, here I feel like you can see how the desire to make a new archetype, basically just for the sake of making a new archetype, well aware that it's not really good to do things this way in this game, is a little frustrating. You know, I feel like this one is a good example because they've done something to make them different that is just bad. You know, they do an extra hit of damage, but it's reduced by armor an extra time, and so that's not good. And their range is the same as Deadeye snipers. They're not even that different, and the way they're different is something that is almost objectively bad in Arknights. You can kind of feel a little more than most other archetypes that they made this archetype to sell more archetypes, that kind of thing. But again, what's kind of weird is there are like none of them. That doesn't really make sense. Like, I'm definitely a little confused about that part. So flingers and also artillerymen and besiegers, there are very few units in those archetypes. They're not very full. Flingers are probably the least full, I would guess. Deadeye, there's like 1 million Deadeyes, and marksman snipers, there's like 1 million marksman snipers. And on the Chinese version of the game, that's a little bit ahead of the global release, there are like other sniper archetypes coming out. What's happening? So I don't really understand that. That doesn't totally make sense. I get making new members of an archetype, but if you have an archetype that has very few units in it, and just as an aside for a second, okay, I think Gray is cute and all, but he and Rosemontis, are there other flingers? Is it just Gray and Rosemontis, pretty much, for units you could just roll? Isn't there that one, like, 1-star unit? But they're from a collaboration thing. Okay, it's basically just Gray and Rosemontis, and Rosemontis is limited. So you can practically only get this archetype by rolling just Gray. Now, no one here is gonna talk any trash about this electromagnetic grenade bowling ball man. He's cute. I think his dispenser for EM grenades is badass. But is this the only way you want to market that entire archetype? This is the unit that you think will appeal to, like, some people? Yeah. But to everybody? No, it doesn't really make sense. Like, you would make somewhat of variety within that archetype. And that's pretty much what is done in most archetypes. You can see that there was this interesting balance between variety, just visual variety, or the way they do the thing. You know, maybe like a marksman sniper. So you might have some people with bows, some people with guns, some people with crossbows, smaller arms, larger arms. Not just variety of like people thinking that this person is cute or that person is cute, but I just mean visual variety generally too. What do they fire? They're a sniper. What is their ranged weapon? You know what I mean? There's a good amount of variety. We even have weirdos like Tomimi in the caster archetype, that she has a staff because she's a caster, but her whole thing is she can become kind of a melee unit for a little bit, and so she just whacks people with the staff. Like stuff like that. You know, they add a little variety like that. But that just hasn't been done at all in these archetypes. Like, why not flesh it out a bit more? It feels like something different. As much as adding new archetypes to the game might motivate people to, I guess, spend money to get a new member of the archetype, I mean, I think it motivates people when things feel different. That's really what this is about anyway, right? Flingers really aren't different from artillerymen in practice. They're basically just worse. And so the difference would be that it feels different. But if that can be done with things other than adding new game mechanics. I don't know. I feel like it kind of erodes the elegance of the game a little bit, where you have this feeling like everything has its purpose. And I think Arknights does that really well. But we may be in a point in history in Arknights where that's beginning to stop. Like, there are new archetypes getting made, and I'm not entirely convinced that actually makes that much sense. Don't get me wrong, there are niches for things in Arknights that you don't see fulfilled that much. So for example, snipers have very few units that have like really long, narrow attack range, like Shiryuki, and she attacks very slow. There is a sniper archetype coming up, a new sniper archetype, that is like super narrow. It's like very, very long, but they don't hit much of anything on the sides, like a railgun kind of thing, I guess. I don't know what this archetype is called. So that's interesting. Like, I get that is a niche we don't have. You see what I'm saying? And there are other classes that have very narrow coverage. So for example, casters come to mind, basically snipers, but with arts damage. They don't have very many archetypes that have meaningfully different range. Most caster archetypes are just like short range, only in front of them, not a wide range, not a long range, only short range in front of them. I would be up for seeing a wider variety of caster ranges. Now, of course, it's worth noting that one of the reasons that we have more variety for snipers is that snipers are more good more of the time. They're kind of the game's basic turret. If it's a tower defense game, but we're deploying people instead of like physical turrets, of course, this is the game's basic turret. A sniper, you could argue, is pretty much the most basic unit of tower defense defending that you could have. And so there are lots of them. It makes sense. There's lots of marksman snipers, the really basic one. It makes sense. I get that. At the same time, there are also a lot of units that have a unique range with a skill. It's not part of an archetype. And I don't really understand that much. So this is not where they get a range extension. This is where they use a skill and they gain like a bespoke range during the skill's activation. A simple example would be Asbestos is a defender. So she's melee, she can attack only in front of her, and she's got a skill where she fires like radiation fire out of her shield, and it hits in two boxes in front of her, 3 wide. I think it hits aerial enemies, like for the duration. Cool, you know, good. Cool. Why? Or why, you know, if the archetype thing is valuable for marketing or whatever, why not make that as like a subclass? I mean, just why a lot of things? I don't know. That's weird. So I don't know. Let's end this critical, but I hope in an enjoyable way, Parley, with just a little bit of discussion for a few minutes about things that Flingers are kind of theoretically good at. We talked about a few of them already. The multi-hit thing isn't guaranteed to be bad. There are enemies that have shields in Arknights that simply need to be hit a certain number of times or have a shield that negates the first few times they take damage. So there are some shield enemies in the like Rhine Lab group. They have a physical bubble around them, and they just have to take any instance of damage. They negate that instance of damage, and then they lose the shield, or they could have multiple, I guess. So you could see Flingers being like, I guess, okay against those, particularly if you shot an enemy and the second explosion hit like some other enemy with a shield, and then what would have been negligible damage absorbs an entire hit of potentially infinitely high damage. Or Gray, being faster and doing multiple explosions, saturates an area that other operators are attacking with damage that wouldn't have been that high, but does happen more frequently in an area, and therefore he basically just deletes the shields while doing okay support damage and slowing enemies, while your other operator firing on that position does the real damage. That seems good, sure. You mentioned the AoE thing already. I feel like it's sort of potato-potato with artillerists, with artillerymen, but definitely not a bad thing. And I think one big advantage that Flingers and artillerymen in particular have is that of the ways to do AoE damage in Arknights, these are the ones that don't have terrible range. Most of the other ways to do that have atrocious range. You have to have a giant horde of enemies right on top of you, and then you can maybe do an AoE and kill them. So having better range is not so bad, maybe. They're meant to find a spot where there are lots of enemies concentrated. Big range seems like good, I guess, for that, in theory. Not always necessary, maybe. An easy way to make a good situation for an AoE unit is to block enemies. So it's fine that a lot of AoE has short range, but maybe not bad if they have longer range. And again, it has good synergy with Gray's slow. If you're going to slow enemies and you have a big range, you can slow them over theoretically a lot of distance they travel. Sure, fine, cool. He does have a module that makes him do more damage to slowed enemies, so that's interesting. They're kind of trying to give him another damage multiplier, I guess, but I'm not sure why it isn't just reducing defense, but then we're just right back to, well, why don't you just do damage in one hit so you don't need to reduce defense? But one thing I did want to mention is that if Flingers had proper kind of opportunity cost, or power budget, I guess I'll say, for their 2-hit damage, that is, because they're going to be reduced by armor twice, they were properly given an increased power budget, higher attack stat, for example. If that happened, which I would argue it doesn't currently, but in theory, if that happened, they would benefit more from armor reduction. If you debuff enemy armor, and there's lots of ways to do that, Flingers would, in that world, benefit more than other units. Their damage would go up a lot more, and they would kind of gain the full strength of that trade-off. It'd be an interesting trade-off normally. They'd be worse against enemies with high armor, but then if you debuffed enemy armor, they would suddenly gain way more damage because they benefit from the debuffed armor twice per attack. And the second hit is weaker, and therefore you get a lot more % of its damage back. I guess that's true now. I just feel like the damage payoff isn't entirely there. And if you're going to debuff armor, there's a lot of very powerful things that you can do with that. It's called defense in Arknights, but yeah, you get it. So I don't know. I mean, it's not all bad. Did I have any other notes? Flingers do attack faster than pretty much all these somewhat similar archetypes we talked about. Besiegers are 2.4, Deadeyes are 2.7, Artillerymen are 2.8 or 2.9, and Flingers are 2.1, so they are substantially faster than similar archetypes, that's true. And the other one that is AoE, the Artillerymen, are the slowest of those, and Flingers are the fastest of them, so that's something, I suppose. I do think the ball lightning thing is legitimately really good. Having inconsistent but constant chance for crowd control, and then you have an ability that guarantees the effect when you need it, seems good. Like, I feel like that's quite good. That's the type of, like, in practice thing that I think evaluations on paper don't reflect as well. So while I haven't played a lot of Gray, my experience has been that when a unit has that combination of effects, it tends to be better than it looks like it would be in practice, you know, if you cover for that. But there's no accounting for taste, I mean playstyle, when you evaluate these things. So, yeah, I think that's all I had to say, just skimming the quick bullet points I took down. This was interesting. Yeah, I think Flingers are a weird one, and they put into question a little bit the way that Arknights makes classes. They, yeah, are... a class that you kind of wonder, why does this exist? Why did they make this? And there isn't really a super clear reason, but there are maybe some reasons you can think of. You know, people want a member of every class or subclass, even if that's misguided or doesn't really matter. The game isn't really designed that way. People might just want that. But then if that's what they want, then why don't they round out classes that already have like irrelevantly few units in them? You know what I mean? I don't know. That part is kind of strange. I would like to close by saying that I think one key note for this type of topic is that there's an appeal in the general public to having a unit that is just kind of janky. Isn't really that bad, though it may be appealing to some people that they are kind of bad. But the idea is they're just kind of weird. It's sort of weird that they exist, and they're just an oddity that is there and kind of satisfying in a way. Having everything feel like the most popular thing is definitely a feeling. You know, not everybody wants that. Some people might want something that's just different. This doesn't have to be because you are a hipster, which I would define as wanting something different for no clear benefit, simply so you can say that you are different than other people. I think there's a different appeal here, where it just creates variety in the experience. That's not necessarily bad. And I do think that to some extent, games just don't worry too much about making a thing here and there that is kind of just janky. But I don't know. Me as a game designer, my 2 cents is that I have given you my $9 on this subject, and so this really will just be 2 cents, which is that I want everything to be its own little experience. I made this piece of game design, I as a game designer want to say to you, because I truly think it's cool. I want you to have a good time playing with it, to have a robust and involved experience of getting into this thing. I want there to be stuff to play around with. I want it to be a complete experience, and I don't care why it is you like it. You're welcome to do that, and you're not going to get a worse experience just because it's a weirder thing. Gray isn't even particularly weird. So for what it's worth, I don't know. I feel like Arknights actually does that sort of well. You have the normal upgrade paths, you can do masteries, you can get his module. He has those things. They gave him some other effects, like the thing where enemies that are slowed take more damage. So, I don't know, I like Arknights in that way, but at the same time, having a unit that is purposefully kind of janky doesn't appeal to me. I feel like things will feel like that anyway. Things will be less popular anyway. Having things that are good in a more niche way is fine. I think within a certain range, it's just not that big a deal if things are less broadly useful. You know, you have a game where 100% of the time, somehow, this unit is good, but then this unit is good 80% of the time. I think those are both high enough that they don't usually register as being meaningfully different in terms of how niche they are. A unit that's good 20% of the time and a unit that's good 10% of the time, same thing. I think they both register as being relatively niche. I'm just making numbers up here, but you get the point. So personally, I think it's nice to lean on the side of giving them more legs. You know, don't worry too much about them doing something in a weird way, but then it's really powerful. It's usually not a problem, I think. Again, I think Arknights is another great example there, because it's a game where if, for example, AoEs are good, they're so good that the unit's power level almost doesn't even matter at that point. They would have to be incredibly underpowered and do basically nothing to be bad in a situation over a single target option if you're blocking like 5 enemies at once. You know, them doing AoE damage to every single target is going to be so strong, it's almost irrelevant, you know, how powerful the unit is. So making them a little more powerful rather than a little bit less doesn't really seem like a problem to me. I guess you could go the other way, and I could have spent this entire parlay talking about how that kind of is a problem, because it means in the situation where there are 5 targets, if Gray is a little powerful, he instantly evaporates all of them in his ideal situation, and therefore to make him feel good when hitting a single target, which is what you're usually doing in this game, you have to, you know, you make him feel comparatively underpowered, so he doesn't feel like he's just ridiculous in those situations, but then when there's AoE situations, he evaporates the known universe. I could have talked about that, but I didn't. And we're not talking about that. I hope you enjoyed this parlay. I thought it was fun. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay, you can do that using a link in the description. Looking forward to the next one.